Africa's resource paradox. Why Africa stays rich in resources but poor in pockets. Welcome to Sia Speaks. Today we are going to talk about something that is really interesting and sad at the same time. We are going to look to answer the question why Africa has so many resources but many Africans are still poor. So if we think about it, Africa is famously rich for its natural resources, from the gold in South Africa to the oil in Nigeria, the diamonds in Botswana to the cobalt in the DRC, and the fertile lands across the continent. So it is not a secret that the continent is packed with a lot of wealth beneath its soil. But the sad part is that millions of Africans are still struggling to make ends meet. How is that even possible with all these resources? So today we're going to unpack that and try to figure out why Africa stays rich in resources but Africans are poor in their pockets. So to understand the problem, we need to go back and look at history, because that's where most things start, in the past. A long time ago, during colonial times, Europe came to Africa but not to help Africans, but to take our resources. They took our gold, our diamonds, and even our labor, and they sent all of it to Europe. Africans didn't even get to see much of it, and they didn't benefit at all, right, from that extraction. So the system was built so that Africa would stay a supplier of raw material, just shipping dirt out of the continent while the Europeans got rich. And even after independence, the systems that were left behind, like the invisible borders that continue to separate communities to this day, and the economies that focus on extracting resources instead of building industries, they still affect Africa today. So when I say our resources, and I mean exactly that, these are African resources. They are part of our land, they are part of our heritage, and they are part of our soil. So they are our resources, but we are not benefiting from it. I know some people might argue that Africans didn't really see the value of these resources until the Europeans arrived. They like to say things like, we didn't have the technology to mine gold or diamonds efficiently, right? Although a part of that may be true, but it's also misleading. Africans had a long and complex relationship with these resources long before colonization. Take gold, for example. It is mentioned many times in the Bible as a symbol of wealth and divine favor, and Africans were very aware of its value in trade, art, and culture, right? So even in Southern Africa, the kingdom of Mapungubwe, which existed around 1000 AD, already had large amounts of gold, which was used to trade with distant lands even as far as the Swahili coast. So gold has been part of Africans for a long time, even long before colonization. And archaeologists have found gold artifacts and like jewelry and ceremonial items, showing that African communities really understood and valued these natural resources. Before Europeans even arrived, Africans traded in gold, ivory, and other commodities with each other and with the Arab and Indian traders. These resources were not just buried as treasures. They were integrated into social, economic, and the cultural lives of Africans. So the Europeans didn't discover value in Africa, they just industrialized extraction and redirected the profits out of the continent. So the first reason Africa is rich in resources but poor in pockets comes from history. The systems that were left by colonization were never built to benefit African people. The next part of the reason, as we look to answer that question, why Africa is rich in resources but poor in pockets, is something economists call the resource curse. It is a weird term, but here's what it means. Sometimes having a lot of resources can actually make things worse instead of better. Why? Firstly, if a country depends on one resource like oil, its economy becomes very sensitive to prices. When oil prices drop, the government earns less money, and that affects schools, hospitals, roads, and other infrastructure, because the money that it gets from exports, it drops in value because of the drop in price of oil. The second part of the resource case is that resource wealth can lead to corruption. If the government controls oil, gold, or diamonds, some people in power might take those resources for themselves instead of helping the country as a whole. So the wealth will end up eventually benefiting only a few elite people. South Africa is a very perfect example for this. The country is packed with gold, platinum, diamond, and coal, but ordinary South Africans often don't see the benefits of having those resources in their country. One reason is the way the mining licenses are currently handled in South Africa. So if you are politically connected in South Africa, it is much easier to get access to lucrative mining opportunities. But if you are just a regular business person, the red tapes can be very overwhelming. So there will be permits and approvals that can take years to clear, to a point where you could be better off as a zamazama. On top of that, some government policies and heavy taxes make it very expensive and risky to invest in industries. So even if you want to process raw materials locally, the high costs combined with slow approvals discourage investment and limit growth, right? So even though South Africa does have enormous resources, political connections and structural barriers often mean that the wealth ends up concentrated in the hands of the few instead of spreading across ordinary citizens. And I suspect this is the case with other African countries as well. If we take a look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, they do have huge amounts of cobalt, copper, and diamonds, but most Congolese people live in extreme poverty. Why? Because of corruption, weak government, and companies taking resources without giving back to the people. You can imagine having diamonds in your backyard, but if the government and companies take all of those profits and there's no system to make sure that people benefit, even though they are in your backyard, you end up getting nothing. That's what happens in many African countries, right? And then the third part of the resource case is that countries with easy resource money often ignore other parts of the economy. So sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, or technology don't grow, and people end up importing things that they could make for themselves. For example, Nigeria does produce a lot of oil, but it still imports a lot of food. So the resources are there, but they don't benefit the people. And this is also because Africa doesn't operate alone. The way the global economy works often makes things worse, right? For example, Africa exports raw materials cheaply, and then it imports finished products at a high price or at high prices. We export cocoa, for example, but import chocolate. Or we export timber, but import furniture. So that means most of the profits leave Africa. Even mining contracts can be unfair. Companies take billions in resources but pay little in taxes. That's why Africa stays rich in resources but poor in pockets. The money leaves the continent before it can help local people. Another reason is that Africa doesn't have enough infrastructure or industries. Even if we do have these natural resources, we still need factories, electricity, roads, and ports to be able to process them and make products, right? Because if we don't, we just export raw materials and import finished goods at high prices, which ends up keeping wealth out of our local economies, right? We also need skilled people to run industries. Schools and universities must train people in science, technology, and businesses, because if that doesn't happen, Africa cannot turn those resources into jobs or real wealth for its people. If we look at places like Dubai in the UAE, for example, most of it is just dry desert land. There are not huge natural resource deposits like gold or oil in every single corner of the UAE, but the country and its people are some of the richest in the world. How is that even possible, right? It is because they invested in skills, infrastructure, trade, tourism, and business, and they created an economy that works for the population. But Africa, on the other hand, with all the resources that it has, we cannot even begin to compare it to the UAE in terms of development. So Africa could learn something from Dubai or the UAE. They could do something similar where we focus on developing people, not just extracting what's under the ground. And then in terms of natural resources and their benefit to locals, we cannot ignore conflict. It is not a secret that resources can cause fights both inside countries and with outsiders. Areas that have a lot of oil, diamonds, or fertile land sometimes become battlegrounds over who controls those resources. It's a fight over territory, right? And when that happens, resources that could fund hospitals and schools end up financing weapons and armies instead. So political instability at the end does scare away investors, because companies wouldn't want to invest in areas where there is a risk of war, there's just political instability. So that becomes a problem in terms of controlling territories, fighting over rich lands, fertile lands, and lands that have huge deposits of natural resources. And to make this point clearer, let us look at some global context. Some Western countries today are among the richest and most powerful in the world, not because the ground beneath them is packed with minerals or oil, but because they accumulated and control huge reserves over those resources. For example, the United States and many European countries hold some of the largest gold reserves in the world in their central banks, even though they don't have nearly as much gold under their soil compared to African countries, right? But they still hold the largest reserves of those resources. The US Fed, for example, holds over 8,000 tons of gold as a reserve asset, far more than most African countries' entire gold reserves. But most of that gold in the US Fed Reserve is not mined in the US. Much of it was bought or accumulated over time and is stored as a financial asset rather than a resource that was extracted from the US. I believe the US was able to accumulate such amounts of gold reserves because they got it for much less than what it's truly valued at, right? Because if you just import it as a raw material and refine it in your own country, it becomes much easier for you to hold large amounts of that resource. So we can contrast that with African countries that sit on vast natural resources but don't always control the flow of wealth from those resources, right? Even though maybe you could find the largest deposits of gold in Africa, but I believe the price of gold is not set in Africa, right? It is the Western powers who determine how much to pay for a single ton of gold, right? Or for an ounce of gold. It is not African countries as producers of gold who set the price of gold. So that shows or tells you how these countries that have these natural resources, but they don't control the flow of wealth from those resources, right? And then political instability, conflict, and external interference do often prevent those resources from translating into broad economic growth. That is true. A current example of this is what's currently happening in Venezuela. The country has some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia, but its economy has collapsed and production has fallen far beyond potential, right? And recently, there has been intense geopolitical tension between the US and Venezuela, including military actions and the detention of Venezuela's president. While official statements focus on charges of democracy, many analysts say access to Venezuela's oil and its critical mineral potential is a core part of what's driving global interest in that country, right? This matters for Africa's resource paradox context because it shows how powerful nations sometimes treat resource-rich countries as strategic prizes rather than as partners. So when outside powers intervene, that disrupts local governance, it scares away investment, and often leaves ordinary people worse off, while the profits end up in foreign hands or in the pockets of the elites that are aligned with those foreign powers. So the resources exist, but conflict and power struggles, both internal and external, can destroy stability and stop those resources from creating stable jobs or real wealth for the local people. Now let us take a look at some examples of success and failures of African countries. Botswana as a country has diamonds and it did well. Why? Because they have strong institutions, they have good governance, and they reinvest money into education, healthcare, and infrastructure. So ordinary people in Botswana benefit and the country and its economy grows. Now if you look at Nigeria, which has oil, but the oil money in Nigeria mostly benefits a small elite group of people. The infrastructure is weak. People struggle with electricity, schools, and healthcare. So the wealth is not shared fairly. Even South Africa, with gold and minerals, still struggles with inequality because the benefits of mining haven't reached every citizen. So what can be done to turn resources into real wealth for people? Firstly, we need better governance and less corruption. Governments need to manage resources transparently and fairly. Secondly, we need to invest in industries so that we don't just export raw materials, but we make the products in Africa, create the jobs in Africa, and keep the money in Africa. Thirdly, we need to diversify so that we don't just rely on one resource. Sectors like agriculture, technology, manufacturing, they all deserve some attention. And then fourth, we need to invest in education and skills. People need these tools, education and skills, to run industries, manage businesses, and to be able to innovate. And then finally, we need to negotiate better deals with foreign companies, especially those that have more power than African countries. Because Africa needs contracts that benefit local communities, not just those foreign investors. And this was actually highlighted at the recent G20 summit that was hosted in South Africa, where President Cyril Ramaphosa and other African leaders pushed hard for something called beneficiation, which means that not just taking minerals out of the ground and shipping them off, but processing and adding value to them before they leave the continent. Because that can create jobs, factories, industries, and much higher income right where the resources come from, instead of those profits going straight to foreign companies. And at the summit, global leaders did acknowledge that Africa has about 30% of the world's critical resources and minerals like platinum, cobalt, and others that are used in technology. But much of that value is still taken abroad as raw materials. So by focusing on beneficiation and local value chains, the idea is that African countries can keep more of the wealth for themselves and benefit their people. That was a clear message from the G20 declaration and Ramaphosa's leadership to make sure that the benefits of our own natural resources happen here at home, not for companies that are far away, right? So in conclusion, why is Africa rich in resources but poor in pockets? So the answer is a mix of history, bad governance, corruption, global trade systems, weak infrastructure, conflict, and a lack of industrialization in Africa. But things don't have to stay this way. Botswana does show it's possible. With the right leadership, investment in people, and fair systems, Africa can turn its resources into real wealth for the people and benefit locals, right? Because these resources are a blessing to Africa, but they can only truly be a blessing if we manage them well. Because wealth is not just in the ground, but it is what you do with it. So if you like this video, hit like, share it with friends, and subscribe to Sia Speaks. And tell me in the comments, what do you think is the biggest reason stopping Africa from turning its resources into wealth for its people? My name is Siyabonga Mokoena. Thanks for watching until the end.